So I forgot to turn on my camera. Okay, again, a quick point. We're on Chaf Aleph and Aleph 21a. Rav says if the animal turns its head from where it's standing in the thoroughfare into a private domain and consumes in the private domain, so then you pay Masha Hezika, the value of the damage. And Shmuel says, no, in that instance, you're potter. You're exempt from payment. So the Gemara says, what's the scenario of the sides of the thoroughfare where you would be chayev? It walked outside of the thoroughfare. It walked, like in Portland, we have the what do they call those things? The food carts, right? Food carts are public property in most cases, or at least it's given to the public to use, but it's not necessarily for cars to be driving through or for animals to be walking through. So an animal leaves the street, walks into the food cart area, and starts eating. So in that case, you have to pay for damages, even though it's public. But people are allowed to put their stuff there. So only the merchants, the food carts, they're allowed to keep their things there. And some people, quote, have a different version of this brisa. They have a standalone brisa. The animal tilts its head over to the private domain or to the sides of the public domain and eats. Rav says Shmuel says you're exempt. According to Shmuel, what's the scenario where you pay what you damage? The mechayev that you pay. According to Shmuel, it's possible where the animal leaves the public domain and goes into the side areas, the sides of the public domain where the merchants are entitled to keep their stuff, and because they're entitled to keep their stuff there, therefore, if the animal goes and consumes, they would be chayev. Sorry, 1 second. The owner of the ox would be liable. Maser of Nachum or Yitzchak. Nachum Yitzchak is the following question. The Mishnah says if the animal takes mi pesach chanos from the entrance to the shop, mishalamis mashanenes, it pays hanol, the benefit, not the damage, which is a lot more. Heichi mishkachasla. How does this make sense according to Rava? Shita, must be a scenario b'machzeres, where the animal standing in the public domain, and it sticks its head into the bullshit, into the china shop, right? Into the granary. Mm-hmm. The Ka'amar Mar, and the Brisa says, the Mishnah says, Mashanenis in Mashazikala, you don't pay what's damaged, you pay only the value of the benefit. So why are you paying the value of the benefit if the animal sticks its head over? You should be paying the value of according to Rav, you should be paying the value of the damages. The animal stuck its head into a place it didn't belong. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so where it says, so they have a picture for you there? There it is. There it is. That picture. Okay. So basically what happens is, if you look at the Gemara, the article, the regular print, the pictures on the right-hand side of the page, where sort of the thoroughfare forces everybody to move from a wide area to a narrow area. So what are the pathways? You have a wide area here, a narrow area here. The pathway is to go along this way. And that's where you have the entrance to the shop, right in that spot where everyone has to move into one place. So the animal can actually consume stuff in the shop while it's walking without having to bend its head over. Therefore, that's sort of the distinction according to Rava. If it sticks its head out, then you have to pay Masha Ezika, what it damages. If it's walking along and it eats, even if it eats in the storefront of the shop, then you would only pay Masha Nenes because the animal had a right to be there. So you don't pay Masha Ezika what was damaged. Eged Amri, an entirely different version of this brisa. Everybody agrees that the animal puts its head over into the private domain. He pligi, what's the debate? The scenario is a different scenario. What's going on here? So we're talking about a guy who built a house, but his house is set back from the public domain. Not only is his house set back, but also his driveway and his gates are also set back. So sort of his private domain now becomes an extension of the public domain. People are able to walk into it. This is common in certain cities and certain types of zoning areas where you're required to give some of your property to the public. Okay, and this is what the Brisa says. Amarav, according to Rav, because you've given up your space to the public domain, then the owner of the animal is also exempt. That's also called the public domain. Shmuel says, I feel even in this scenario, you're also chayev. Okay, this next Gemara is a bit complicated. So let's go through it. You have a scenario where a guy has a different scenario. We're going to try to compare two separate scenarios. So what's the scenario? A guy digs a pit in his own domain. What's the halach if somebody falls in?
Somebody what's in?
Somebody falls in.
Digs a pit in his own domain. I think he's totally responsible, isn't he?
Responsible, yeah.
I dig a pit on my own property.
Yeah.
Somebody comes in and falls in.
Yeah.
Chayev or not?
Oh, you're not?
I believe you are, aren't you? I mean,
You're not chayev. You're not chayev. Bor specifically has to be in a place where it's for other people to stumble. If they came into my domain and they had no business being there, I'm exempt.
I'm going to sue you anyway, just for the fun of it.
Now, there's a very interesting scenario here. A guy digs a pit in his domain, and then he makes his property ownerless, but not his pit.
Okay.
Well, then if it's ownerless, doesn't it enter technically into the realm of public domain? Which means
correct.
Now he's in trouble. Now he's in trouble.
Oh, okay. Well, is he in trouble? That's sort of the question. Because in this case, we have a very interesting feature with a bar. Why are you chayav for a bar? For digging a pit?
Like an obstacle.
So the Gemara says, "Al iske kriya upsicha." The liability comes from the fact that you created the stumbling block. Now over here, I'm not chayav because I created the stumbling block. Because when I created the stumbling block, it was in my property. Very good. So therefore, the question is, are you chayav in this situation or not?
What about if you didn't create the pit, but it's there in the property anyway? How does that affect the picture?
Then certainly it should make a difference. Certainly it should be even less. In other words, the question here is you created a pit, but this is not the type of pit that you're liable for because it's in a private domain. Then you make your domain ownerless, but not your pit. You keep the pit, you make ownerless the domain.
Right.
This is a debate between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Rav Amar Potter Kasava Bar B'Shusei Chayev. Rav says you're chayev in a bar b'shusei. What does that mean? That means that the land that you made ownerless is not really ownerless. You really still own it to some extent. 1 second. Okay, let me explain a little bit differently. When we talk about the pit that you created on your own domain that you wanted to keep, it doesn't necessarily mean that the pit is in the ground.
Where else would it be?
The concept of bur is a stumbling block. So, for example, you could put an above ground rock that people should trip over. Or alternatively, and this is most important to what we're talking about here, you can leave a fruit to dry. You're making raisins, sun-dried raisins, or sun-dried anything for that matter. Now, if I leave this sun-dried raisin, so this is a good example of something where you'd want to keep the bur. So, for example, over here, you didn't want the property, you made it ownerless, but you want to be able to dry your raisins there. So you line the place with grapes, and you want to turn it into raisins. So you're keeping the raisins, but making the property ownerless. Now, if according to Rav says you'd be chayev. I'm sorry. Rav says that you'd be chayev on the bar. If somebody trips over the raisins, you'd be chayev. Why is this? 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So according Rav says you're chayav. What does that mean? That means that if you make your property ownerless next to a public domain and people walk in and trip over your grapes, you're chayav. That means that it is public domain. And that's what Rav says in this scenario where you gave up of your property to a public domain, but yet you decided to keep grain there. That if an animal eats from your grain, the owner of the animal is exempt, because this property is public now. Shmuel says the opposite. Shmuel Amar Chayev for some barber should say potter. Shmuel says no. Because your grapes were on something that was formerly your property, so therefore the animal should not have gone there. And if it trips over the grapes, then the owner of the property, the owner of the grapes, would be exempt from damages. If the owner is exempt, presumably he's allowed to keep his grapes there. If he's allowed to keep his grapes there, then if an animal comes to eat them, chayev because of shame. Shmuel Mechayev, let's have a barber shoe say potter. Amar lach Rav would say no. There's no comparison. It could be that I'd agree that if the animal trips over the grapes, the owner of the grapes is exempt. The shiny hachal, the Amar lav kokaminach mekarvetz lahu leperesecha. 1 second. In other words, it could be that I can understand that this pit, because it was laid at a time that he owned the property, it's considered like a pit in a private domain. But that doesn't change the fact that if he stores his grain there and my animal comes at a point where my animal has a right to come, then he should still I should be exempt for the actions of my animal, because my animal was supposed to be there, not supposed to, but it was allowed to be there, and he should have known that and should have been careful not to put his stuff there. It's actually not a comparison.
He'd be allowed to be there.
So it's maximum. I'm sorry. What do you mean? Because it's a public area.
Public area, but
It's not a public area. It's a place the public has a right to be.
But he's
private. So in the case of Shane, we're talking about
private area.
So in the case of Shane, we're talking about a scenario where the guy, let's say you have some of the streets here where you're allowed to build your house, but it has to be set back from the street a certain amount of feet.
Okay.
Put up a fence, but you can't put up a fence on the sidewalk. Okay. You have to set it back. That means, in effect, that certain, let's say, for example, over here on the sidewalk is that second part of the sidewalk, right between the sidewalk and the street. It's like a little bit of grass. Okay, yeah. You can't put a shed down there. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes it's sort of somewhat open to the public. That area.
What would be the status? Of course, in the city, they are in the habit of making sidewalk gardens. I believe the sidewalks along the curbs in the city, I think, are still public property, but people treat it like private property, and they grow and put in all sorts of stuff. What's the legal status of that?
So I don't know this. I don't know the codes in the city. I have no clue who actually owns that spot or not. But the point here, what I'm trying to say is that even let's say that you actually do own the curb garden. Yeah. But it's clearly there are restrictions of what you can do with it, even if you own this, because
it's right next to
exactly. There's certain rules.
Put a tannery on it, for example.
What?
You can put a tannery on it, for example, without permission of the city.
And if let's say you move back your house and your garden from the public area, the first couple of feet, it could be understood people are going to walk there.
Okay. Right. Okay.
And therefore, if you store your stuff and an animal comes and takes it, that's very different than the grapes, laying grapes and then making your property ownerless. Rav would say even if even if you put down the grapes, then you made your property ownerless. In which case you're exempt from damages because you put down the grapes when it was permitted for you to put down the grapes. But over here it would be different, because over here the animal has a right to be there. The animal has a right to be there. Be careful where you put your grain down. Okay. Shmuel says, typically speaking, a bar in a private domain, a bar that was placed in a private domain, and then you made the domain ownerless, would be chayev. 1 second. Okay, it could be that Shmuel would say bar b'shus is chayev, which means that if the animal trips over the grapes, because the property was ownerless and the animal had a right to be there, then therefore the owner should have cleaned up the grapes. The owner of the grapes is chayev because of bar. The grapes are his bar. The Mishnah Barak Lameimar lav adaite. In other words, the guy who was watching the animal does not, because the animal is allowed to roam in now, does not have to watch his animal, and therefore could not have expected that a pit would appear there. However, el peris mik lameimar lav adaite achazile. 1 second. Over here, the guy should have known better to watch his animal. He sees the grain, even though maybe his animal's allowed to roam the area, but the guy is allowed to put down his grain there too. If he's allowed to put down his grain in the property, so therefore, 1 second. So therefore, the owner of the animal should have watched the animal.
Page position, please.
21b, and we're 6 lines down. Last four on the line. Tanoi, now 7 lines. Tanoi. I'm sorry, Le Machzeres Tanoi. Let's say this question of Machzeres, which is Machlokes in Rav and Shmuel, is a Machlokes Tanam. Again, Rav says Machzeres means the animal sticks its head into a private domain and eats. Rav says in that scenario, what's the law? You're chayev. The owner of the animal must pay the damages. Where Shmuel says, no, that's called eating in a public domain. You don't pay damages, you pay only the benefits. Tanya, we learned, the animal eats in the street, it pays the benefit, not the damages, which is a lot more than the benefit. We see the from the sides of the street, pays the damages. Divra Meir, that's the opinion of Meir. I'm sorry, Divra Meir of Rabbi Yehudah. This is the opinion of Meir and Rabbi Yehudah. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Lazar, I remember Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Lazar say, it's not normal for the animal to eat, only to walk. Not clear what that means. Gemara says Rabbi Yossi Hainatana Kamma. Rabbi Yossi seems to be the first opinion. 1 second. Yeah, okay, 1 second. So the Gemara is presuming that ein darka lechel. It's typically not its way to eat, only to walk. What exactly does that mean? 1 second. Okay, in other words, Rav Yossi says that an animal in the sides of the public domain, it doesn't stop to eat. It's supposed to be walking there. If it stops to eat, then you should be chayev, which appears to be exactly like the first opinion, that if it eats in the public domain, you're exempt. If it eats in the private domain, if it eats in the sides of it, the area is designated for commerce, then you would be chayev. So the Gemara says, Ela machzeres the difference must be, the debate here is whether the animal sticks its head into the private domain. Tanakama savar machzeres now mishal mashanenes. The first opinion says that machzeres pays the benefit, not the damages. For benefit meaning the fact that you don't have to feed your animal. For Rabbi Yossi says mishalemes masha hezika. You pay the damages. Presumably, this is the debate, and this is the same debate between Rav and Shmuel. So Gemara says, "Loi de kula alma machzeres ikaravi kishmuel." Machzeres, either they hold like Rav that you're chayev, or like they hold like Shmuel that you're potter. The question is, the Torah requires you to eat in a different animal's field. Eat in a different owner's field. A different animal. The animal has to eat in somebody else's field. Marsavar, one opinion says a beer b'stei one opinion says it has to eat in another person's field and not in a public domain. Marsavar beer b'stei achar v'lo b'reshus hamazik. If it brings, if it has to eat in another person's field and not in the field of the one who did the damage. 1 second. In other words, if the limitation here is that according to Rabbi Yossi, if a person brings his animal a person brings his grain into somebody else's property, and that other person's animal eats the grain, then you're exempt. But presume
Rabbi, repeat that last sentence, please.
if somebody brings his grain into Reuven's property, and Reuven's animal goes ahead and eats it, then you're exempt.
Absolutely.
That's not a different person's field. In this second opinion would hold that in a public domain it could be you'd be chayiv because of shame. I believe. Let me just double check that. Okay. So in this opinion, the debate here is, how do we define stei achar, a different field? Is it literally a different field, meaning a field that's owned by somebody else, or does it mean it's as opposed to a public field, a public domain, or does it mean that if you're sort of complicit in the fact that the animal ate because you brought the grain in there in the first place, so then you'd be exempt? The Gemara is not happy with this opinion because it says, what is your animal doing in my property? Why do I need a verse to exempt me from payment? The exemption should be self-evident. Your animal, your fruits in my domain had no business being there. I never gave you permission. So if my animals ate it, too bad. Okay. So the Gemara concludes, the difference here between the two opinions is the difference between Ilfa and Rabbi Shia, which is if the animal eats from on top of another animal. So that you have a pack animal carrying the burden, and another animal comes and eats off the top of the animal. So that's the difference here between, according to Rav Meir, you'd be exempt, and according to Rabbi Yossi, you'd be chayev. Okay, let's see the next Gemara here. Hakela v'agdish kaftzim meresh hagag. A dog or a goat that jumped off a roof, v'shavros hakelim, and they broke vessels. Mishalom nazik shalom, they pay full damages. Because this is normal behavior. This is what we call regal. It's normal for an animal to jump, for these types of animals to jump off the roof. Hakelav shenot l'charora v'holach l'kadosh. We saw this mission earlier. A dog that takes a cookie it's on a coal, and it goes.
Give a dog a cookie.
And it goes to a stack of hay. It eats the cookie. It lights the hay on fire. On the cookie, it pays full damages. On the hay, it pays half damages. Why does it pay half damages? So the hay, we'll have to see. There are two possible explanations. One of them is that it's tzroros. Tzroros is the pebbles the animal kicks. So the fire is sort of like the pebble of the animal. The other possibility here is that this is unusual behavior and therefore it's keren. So it's half damages of keren. Okay. Taima de kafzu. The Mishnah is pointing out that if the animal jumps off the roof, then you'd be chayev. But if it was hanaflu, let's say the animal fell off the roof, potter, you'd be exempt. Because these types of animals, a goat and a dog, typically don't fall off the roof. So the Gemara says, Alma kasavar, evidently he holds, chilasa b'pshia b'seifa b'aynes potter. Okay, so over here, the guy is letting his animal walk across a narrow wall. Now, it would be normal for a goat to jump off the wall, but not to fall off the wall. So the guy's clearly not watching his goat when it's on the wall because it's a narrow wall. He's entitled not to watch it because he's expecting his animal to jump off. And a goat obviously can do that. But all of a sudden it falls off. So he was doing the correct thing by not watching it because he expected it to jump down, and that he was watching for. But now that it fell down, you're telling me that he's exempt. Why is he exempt? He's guilty for letting the animal walk on the roof in the first place. He should have been watching it then. He was negligent in allowing the animal to jump to run on the narrow roof because it could have jumped off and done damage, but he could not have expected that it would fall off and do damage. So evidently, our mission says if a guy starts off negligent but then ends up inadvertently causing damage without intention, he's exempt. Tanya Nami Hachi, the Bride supports this as well. If they jump off, they pay full damages. Naflu, if they fall off, Ptur, they're exempt. So the says, Potter. This makes sense according to the opinion that says that if he's intentionally negligent and inadvertently causes damage, he's exempt for the inadvertent damage. Right. The typical example of this is a guy was driving recklessly. Okay. And then what actually happened was he popped his tire and slammed into another car.
Okay.
So that's sort of he's less culpable for his tire popping for no apparent reason. No reason he could have readily prevented. But he sort of was in the middle of engaging in negligent activity.
Exactly, an activity. Would the tire have popped if he had been riding more
Let's say
slowly?
it would have popped anyway.
Then it might have popped at a different time, place, and speed with less traffic. There could have been, in another scenario, there could have been less or no damage to anything else.
Let's say it probably would have happened anyway.
Yeah, but the outcome, the impact could have been different.
Let's say it's like
more slowly and responsibly.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the question the Gemara is dealing with. The event probably would have been similar. In other words, it's probable that if the animal jumped off, it probably would have broken this stuff. But now that it fell off, it broke the same stuff inadvertently. So it's a machlokes whether or not you're chayav. But if you hold your chayav, what's the explanation of the Mishnah? Michael Gemara says very simple solution here. If the animal jumps, typically it jumps a distance. It travels while it jumps.
Mm-hmm.
So the place was lined up with barrels, let's say. Okay. The more distant barrels would have broken. But what actually happened is the animal fell and the closer barrels broke.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a different set of barrels.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, that's why you'd be chayav. That's why you'd be potter, because you've been negligent in a different set of barrels. Had the animal, let's say there were rows of barrels. The fourth row, the animal would have jumped on.
Mm-hmm.
The first row close to the wall, the animal would have never jumped on. But the animal fell on them and shattered them. So you're negligent in the fourth row, but you broke the first row. Therefore, everyone agrees you're exempt.
Well, then question.
You gotta keep going.
Scenario question comes. Different animals can jump different distances.
We're talking here about a goat and a dog, and a specific where a specific amount would be taken into account. Okay. If they jumped, it would not have fell on it. It's not even chilas. It's not even negligent at the beginning because it was negligent in a different set of barrels. Amar of Zvid, Mishmeder Rav. Zvid says in the name of Rav. It's possible that even if it falls, you'd still be chayev. How is it possible? Because of ru'ah, with a shaky wall, a wall that's about to fall. Mind you, exactly what happened. The guy should have realized that the wall could have fell down. The Gemara says, ultimately speaking, the bricks didn't fall. It was the animal that fell. This is another example of where over here it's the same stuff, right? The guy is guilty in the first row of barrels. Why? Because if the wall falls down, the first row will be damaged. And now what happens? Inadvertently, the wind blows the animal down and damages the first row of barrels. That is chilas of shivas b'ainis, and that depends on the debate. he was negligent in the first row of barrels, but then it happened inadvertently.
Page position again, please, Rabbi.
4 lines in the bottom of the page. We're talking here about a very narrow wall where even a goat would have trouble keeping its balance. Now, goats are obviously notorious for being able to keep balance in very narrow areas.
Right.
But even this, you watch those pictures, the edge of the cliffs, the goats walking right up on the edges. But even this wall was so narrow, he could have expected his goat might fall down. If they jump from the bottom upwards, Paturin, they're exempt. Okay, so here's another fact about goats and dogs. When they jump, they typically jump down and not up. So they're on the narrow cliff, then they jump off the cliff. They don't jump up to the cliff. So if it jumps upward, that's mishuna, that's unusual. Yeah. Therefore, you're exempt from full damages. Other than a person or a chicken should dolgo a person and chickens, they jump in both directions. The Gemara says, what do you mean? There's a brayse that says in both directions you're exempt. In other words, if a goat jumps up or jumps down, you're still exempt from damages. What happened was it was an unusual type of jump. This is not regular jumping. Kalba b'skira. The dog had an unusual type of jump. The goat sort of slid down as opposed to jumping down. So jumping down is the normal behavior, sort of grabbing onto the wall, like a parkour artist, and then going down. That's sort of unusual for the goat. And therefore, why are you exempt completely? So the Gemara says, no, you're not exempt completely. It's abnormal. You have to pay half damages because it's unusual behavior. And unusual behavior pays half damages. Okay, next Gemara. This will start today. Very enjoyable Gemara, and we've already mentioned that. I think I mentioned it right at the beginning of the Masechta, and very, very foundational. Itmar Rabbi Yochanan Amar Eshem Shem Chitza v'Rish Lakish Amar Eshem Mishum Mayne. Discussion here about Eish, fire. Why are you chayev? Because if a person lights a fire and the fire does damage, why are you chayev? Is it because the fire is your arrow? Chitzav, chetz. It's like an arrow, like you draw an arrow and you release the arrow. The fire is the arrow that you released. Or do we say no? Fire is like your money. Just like you own an animal, you own a pet, you own the fire. You lit this fire, you own the fire. Okay, we'll see. The Gemara goes back and forth. Let's explain. Why does Rish Lakish disagree that fire is like an arrow? Why does he think fire is not like an arrow? So Gemara says, Amar Lach, Rish Lakish would say, the arrow, right? The bowstring contains your own energy, right? By pulling back in the bowstring, that's your energy that you're releasing. But a fire is not your own energy. Fire is sort of like a power that you control. What does that sound similar to? An ox, right?
Oh, okay.
You don't push the ox. The ox eats and it moves on its own. A fire is the same thing. Why does Rabbi Yochanan disagree with Rish Lakish? Rabbi Yochanan says, your ox, I could point to. I can lift it up. It's a physical thing. I can slaughter it and eat it too. However, just like the bowstring, what's unique about the bowstring? There's no way to capture the fact that there's latent energy in the bowstring, right? Or in the arrow at the beginning of its flight, before that energy actualizes, kineticizes. And that's very similar to a fire, where you can't actually grasp the fire. Whereas a person's own money, typically they can hold their own money. Pick it up, hold the coins as before the days of Bitcoin, right? And you have an ox, you can hold it. It's something there. That's what it means. It's your money. Your money is tangible. This is not tangible, right? It's an NFT. Okay. Tanan. You have the story of the dog that takes the cookie, right? It puts it on the stack of hay and burns the stack of hay. So let's examine this. If the story here is that Eish is like an arrow, well then chitzav the keleful. This is the arrow of the dog, and therefore you'd be chayev chatzi nezik because it's sroiros. It's the pebbles. Just like the animal could kick pebbles, the animal presumably can draw bowstrings or light fires. It doesn't have to draw bowstrings. Okay, it's a joke. But it can light fires. So therefore, it's chitz of the kelev. It's tzroros. That's why you have to pay half damages. According to the opinion that says that a fire chayev because it's your money. Hayesh lav memayne bal kelefum. Presumably, the dog doesn't know how to strike a match, right? Obviously, where the dog got the cookie from, he found it in a fire. The cookie that's a coal, he found the cookie coal in the fire, so he picked it up. So the guy who owns the fire, he should be chayev for the damages, not the owner of the dog. It's not the owner of the dog's fire. You heard the question?
The dog picked it up without hurting its mouth.
So it looks like it was sort of a big cookie, and half of it was cold, burned, and the rest of it. Okay.
All right.
Shlagish says, what happened was it sort of dragged it. It dragged the coal onto a pile of hay. For the cookie, he pays full damages. It's not chayav for the fire. The fire that results afterwards and burns the entire stack of hay, you're exempt from. What are you not exempt from? You're not exempt from the place where the coal was actually placed. That specific location. That specific location is the damage of the dog. The dog took a torch and torched something. The specific spot it torched, you're chayav for. That's your animal's doing. How much you chayav? That's unusual. Unusual behavior is chatzi nezek. Whatever got burnt afterwards, it's true. It's not the dog's fire, somebody else's fire, and therefore you're exempt from everything else. Okay. Rabbi Yochanan the ancha anuche. According to Rabbi Yochanan, if the animal put down the coal, al charora Rabbi Yochanan would say you're liable for the cookie and the spot where it puts down the coal, because according to Rabbi Yochanan, if it's going to eat the cookie, then it might put the cookie down to eat. So it eats the cookie and not the coal. So actually on the spot the animal puts down the cookie, that's normal behavior. You're chayav nezik shalom. It's part of eating. And on the rest of the pile, you're chayav chatzi nezik, half damages. Okay, tomorrow we get to one of the interesting scenarios in Shas when we talk about Hanukkah. Okay. So tomorrow we'll review this debate between Rabbi Yochanan and Shlokish, and the Gemara is shorter tomorrow. Hopefully we'll catch up and get right on to